And I'm Anna Doty with Washington Environmental Council. Use she, her pronouns. Thanks for being here. I'll popcorn to Sarah.
Sarah, I think you're on mute.
Thanks, Marquise.
There we go.
I'm Sarah Cornett. I'm the Climate Program and Advocacy Manager for Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility. And I'll popcorn to Jessica.
Good afternoon. I'm Jessica Zimmerly. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Program and Outreach Director at Earth Ministry in Washington, Interfaith Power and Light. And I think the last organizer is Victoria. Popcorn to you.
That is me. Thanks, Jess. Hi, everyone. My name's Victoria Leastman, and I'm the Dirty Fuels organizer at the Sierra Club, and I use she, her pronouns. And I will send it back to Marquise.
Alrighty, so thanks everyone for introducing yourselves. So for the folks who are in the webinar format, feel free to put any questions in the chat. We would love to hear from you. We're gonna get things started with kind of just a little bit of background on who we are and why we're here. So I'm gonna jump into presentation mode in a second so y'all can see the screen with me. So just bear with me for 1 second. Alrighty, so yeah, as everyone knows who signed up, we're here to speak about the interim regulations. So a little bit of background. So we are presenting to you today as the Tacoma Tideflats Coalition, or the Protect the Tacoma Tideflats Coalition. And we're a coalition of grassroots organizing groups based in the local area and then in Washington State in general, who fight for strengthening of our interim regulations. We have a relationship with the sub-area planning process. And we mostly organize around making sure that there's no expansion of polluting industries in the port, and that we have further protections for our public health, for the wellness of our communities. I think with coronavirus right now, this fight is actually more important than ever, because we know that communities hit the hardest by polluting industries are also communities hit hardest by public health crises, coronavirus being the most recent, but certainly not the first. So as you can see on the screen, these are some of the groups that we work with. So some of the facilitators, as you've already heard today, will be from Citizens for Healthy Bay, Washington Environmental Council, the Sierra Club, the Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility, Earth Ministry, and then this presentation was the idea of 350 Tacoma. So nobody here is facilitating from 350, but they've been involved with this project, and we wanted to give them a shout out, as you can see. So we're going to get started on the background of the Tacoma Tideflats. So you're going to hear from Tony and Victoria about just a little bit of background and going into the rest of our presentation.
Thanks, Marquise. Yeah, so we wanted to start today to just talk a little bit about like what land and whose land are we talking about when we say the Tacoma Tideflats. And so this is the area that is currently the Port of Tacoma. It is what's considered immediately adjacent to the Puyallup Reservation. But we know that the Puyallup have been in this place since time immemorial, and that the land as designated by the Medicine Creek Treaty of 1854 actually does incorporate the Tacoma Tideflats. So the Medicine Creek Treaty was signed in 1854 at a meeting at Medicine Creek, which is in present-day Thurston County. And it was Governor Isaac Stevens at the time. And the tribe ceded most of their land in exchange for $32,500 and reservations and the permanent right to access their traditional and fishing grounds in that area. And so that's not a lot of money for a place that up until modern history was teeming with wildlife and salmon and just had been where their people had always been. And if you actually look at lines about where the Medicine Creek Treaty was drawn, it's actually really interesting because the area that is the Port of Tacoma is a largely fake land, right? That land was actually dredged up and created when it was formerly just water. So what's really interesting about this is that no one can prove that it isn't Puyallup's land. There have actually been a series of protests that have happened due to fossil fuel industry in that area. where those protesters, or protectors, I should say, have been acquitted because the court couldn't prove that it wasn't Puyallup land. So I just want to be really clear that when we talk about the Tacoma Tideflats, the Puyallup tribe has the biggest stake in the game here because they've been there since time immemorial. So now we're going to move on and just show a brief video about how we got from that teeming estuary to what we're talking about today, which is the sub-area planning process. And I'll just say briefly before we go to the video, right, that the Port of Tacoma today looks very different. And it was created by Pierce County in 1918, and it is a deep water port and has one of the largest container ports in North America, which is why it has all of these huge fossil fuel threats. So this is a video created by our friends at 350 Tacoma, and it's just about 2 minutes long, and it gives a really great overview about what we're talking about.
Alrighty, folks, so we're going to try to make sure that the audio works. So if it doesn't work, please comment in the chat or let us know. And I think it should be fine, but, you know, Zoom, we never really know. So without further ado, let's see if it works.
What are Tideflats interim regulations? What is the Tideflats sub-area plan? Well, after the community rose up and defeated the world's largest methanol refinery proposal, the city of Tacoma realized that it had a problem with zoning in the port. Namely, that there really aren't zoning regulations in the port. Technically, any kind of polluting industry could be located there. The city was also concerned about encroachment of non-industrial uses by residential areas. So the city decided to start a process to make new regulations saying what kinds of buildings, businesses, and industry can be in the port and where. This is called the Tideflats Sub-Area Plan. But that plan could take years, and in the meantime, all sorts of businesses and industry could move in and ruin any attempts at planning. To prevent that from happening, the city wisely enacted interim regulations that barred many non-industrial and heavy industrial uses from moving into the Tacoma Tideflat. Current industry is grandfathered in. With time to plan, the city, the port, the county, and the Puyallup tribe are now working together to create a new sub-area plan for the port. In the meantime, though, the interim regulations must be renewed by the Tacoma City Council every 6 months. While we are happy to have these interim regulations protecting us, we do believe they should go a step further and include a ban to prevent current industry from expanding. After all, how can residents and the city make a plan if the map keeps changing?
Thanks, Marquise. That was a lot better the last time. Thank you for sitting tight, everybody. So what I'll just say too briefly before I hand it over to Tony, right? So that was a great overview of what the sub-area planning process is. So it's this 3 to 5 year planning process that is going to determine what can and what cannot develop at the Port of Tacoma in the Tacoma Tideflats. So what's been happening in the interim is interim regulations, which we're about to talk about. But the overall sub-area planning process, it took a long time just for the entities listed there, the City of Tacoma, the Puyallup Tribe, the Pierce County, Port of Tacoma, and the City of Fife, to even get an agreement on how they would work together. So it's a long planning process, and that's why we really need to make sure that we have strong regulations while we're developing this plan. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tony.
Cool. Thank you so much, Victoria. If we can go to the next slide. Awesome. So as the video and Victoria said, so these were basically interim regulations to prevent new fossil fuels from developing while the sub-area process is happening. So they were first enacted in 2017, and as noted in the video, that really came due to public concern and public outrage because of the proposed methanol facility. And a big impact was obviously the public outcry around health and safety of residents. So we obviously recognize the need for a sub-area plan to determine land use. And in the interim, we wanted to make these regulations to limit fossil fuels. Now, the original intent behind this was to limit the impacts of regulated industries on, quote, the health, safety, and welfare of the public and local environment while the sub-area plan was happening. at that point, they would have final regulations. So the problem is that this only really covers new fossil fuels and not existing. So existing fossil fuel terminals and industry can really expand without a whole lot of checks on them. So what we're asking for is to basically close the loophole that existing fossil fuels cannot expand. And this really isn't novel. This is basically a pretty reasonable policy to protect local health and safety due to the fact that ports in the Northwest are all over being targeted as extraction sites. And it's also something that we've seen in other regions. Whatcom County has led a successful effort to impose interim regulations on fossil fuels and expanded them to better protect the community. This is a clear, very sensible oversight to protect the public. So right now we're coming up this May for, I believe, the 4th renewal. And these renewals are going to happen every 6 months. And there's been one attempt to really expand the regulations to close that loophole, but it's failed. So as of right now, we really need additional pressure. So far, the city council, which holds all the cards here, has really, as a whole, sided with fossil fuel companies and not the health and safety of Tacoma residents. We know U.S. Oil and the Port of Tacoma really have a strong foothold with the city council and are set to expand their power under the guise that expansion of fossil fuels is going to be good for the local economy and good for energy needs. In reality, we know that increased regulations are going to be essential to protect the health and safety of residents, to preserve the land for better, cleaner jobs that make a better use of the land, especially for jobs per acre, and are more forward-thinking on how we need to grow the economy. So right now, we really need additional pressure because we have a new lay of the land with city council. Due to the 2019 elections, 2 of our good environmental champions who have really championed increased interim regulations, increased regulation on these fossil fuel industries are no longer in office. They've been termed out. And we have an all-new city council with two additional members. Because of that, they need to hear from residents really for the first time on why this is important and why it's necessary to protect the safety and health of Tacoma. Next slide. Awesome, perfect. Thank you. So finally, we want to really talk about how this threat is clearly very real and very present. We're very much familiar with the LNG facility that's under construction. That's really expected to be completed, next March at the earliest, which really feels right around the corner. So while the regulations wouldn't necessarily affect that plant, we know the threat of fossil fuels and expanding fossil fuels is extremely real. It's present. And we know fossil fuel companies like Par Pacific and U.S. Oil are at risk of expanding. Tacoma continues to be a really hot target for dangerous new oil and gas projects. And we know that last year, fossil fuel companies have had their eye on Tacoma, including the interest for a new oil transloading facility and a chemical plant that's interested in converting to store bulk fossil fuels. So now, by preventing these dangerous proposals, the interim regulations worked because they were, quote, new. However, these same projects can be pretty easily altered or technically proposed and improved as expansions of existing facilities with no additional oversight or protections. So this loophole, this real big gap, is a huge level of inconsistency and is super dangerous. It leaves Tacoma at enormous risk because whether something is, quote, new or, quote, existing, if it's a dirty fossil fuel that's polluting Tacoma's air and threatening the safety of residents, it's still the exact same threat. And we also know that Seaport Sound is bringing more crude oil trains through Tacoma. So clearly, the health of the community is at risk. Current events make this more clear than ever. We have rollbacks at the federal level for environmental protections by the Trump administration. Attempts to use the COVID crisis to actually support and prop up the fossil fuel industry with stimulus money. And clearly, the COVID crisis has exacerbated the effects of respiratory issues like asthma that are caused from pollution from the fossil fuel industry. So this is clearly a crisis that has been exacerbated by COVID, but it's one that is very indicative of why we need an expanded regulatory system that makes sure that existing fossil fuels can no longer expand.
Alrighty, so thank you so much, Tony. We're going to transition into crafting your public testimonial and sharing your story. So Jessica from Earth Ministry is going to take part of this away. I thought this was a good photo to kind of show this Jessica testifying at the Citizens Forum. I think it's now called the Community Forum for the City of Tacoma. So without further ado, we're going to get started. Alrighty, so really quick, before we jump into that, we're going to do just a little bit of an overview on the public hearing. So the hearing is going to be next Tuesday during the community forum time. Your testimonials will happen in front of City Council, although obviously because there is social distancing, it's going to be a telephonic option, which you kind of see there's some information on below. So at current, folks have to call the number that is 253-591-5383 to get more information about how the telephonic option is going to be happening. That's going to be for this Friday. So Citizens for Healthy Bay and some of the other groups are going to be calling. So folks probably don't need to, because we're going to be doing some sharing of information around that. But if folks do want to call in themselves, feel free to. So for the testimonials, folks should be planning on keeping their testimonials to about 2 minutes or 1 minute if they can. And yeah. So before we get into kind of crafting your testimonial, let's talk about what are the high level talking points for strengthening the current regulations. These are going to be crucial for folks to kind of be able to share with City Council about how these issues and these talking points intersect with who they are as a person, which obviously Jessica's going to jump into later. But the 5 high level talking points are to protect the health and safety of Tacoma, the regulations must be extended to prohibit expansions and conversions on existing facilities, which Tony just spoke to, because that's kind of an important loophole in the current regulations. The interim regulations that protects the health and safety of Tacoma is clearer than ever that this public health crisis and economic crisis reveals that there's huge inequalities and vulnerabilities of our system. Obviously, with oil being volatile now, the cracks are bigger than ever. The fossil fuel industry is targeting Tacoma. So I think Tony mentioned that there's been 2 proposed targeting of Tacoma Tideflats in the last year alone. Because we're in a crisis point, Tacoma is more at risk than ever. There's some new reports that are looking at how pollution actually relates to coronavirus that's under peer review right now. So while that's not substantiated at the highest level, they're looking at to see if COVID-19 can be spread more easily via polluted air. So that's something to think about. And then the final point is that this crisis is an opportunity. The interim regulations and sub-area plan are critical tools to lead to a clean and equitable economic recovery. And obviously, with oil being volatile right now, polluting industries is not being good for us in general. We can look to kind of reshaping how we want to rework our economy going forward. And then these are some couple talking points for folks who are outside of Tacoma, because we understand that there's some folks on this webinar right now who are maybe north or east of us. So a big one is that the decisions that are made for the interim regulations that affect the sub-area plan affect the entire state's fossil fuel network. With oil prices tanking and lower energy demands, there's actually increased storage capacities needed because not as much fossil fuels are being used. And then the final one is that the majority of oil that comes to Tacoma is by rail, which is obviously a huge risk. Alrighty, so Jessica's going to take it away.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I saw in the chat somebody asking for talking points. So I believe we can send a follow-up email to you all that will include that information. There will be actually an entire toolkit, and the talking points will be in there. I forgot we put that together for you. So you'll have plenty of resources to move forward with. And for now, what we're going to really dig into is our testimony and thinking about what we want to share with the council this coming Tuesday. So I work at an organization called Earth Ministry, and we work specifically with the constituency of people of faith. And within that, we really dive into our values. And even if you're not a person of faith, totally fine. We all have values. We just have different language for how we express them. So as we go through a testimony training now, I really invite you to move kind of from a head space into a heart space. So I think oftentimes when we're thinking about talking to a decision maker, we're really tempted to hit hard with the facts, but really it's a story, a value, a shared experience that resonates and will stick with them and keep coming back up at the end of the day, right? So you could throw out numbers about tons of carbon or methane emitted and the greenhouse gas effect, et cetera. Or you could say, you know, my kid has asthma and all of their friends have asthma and they just think that's how the world is. And that breaks my heart, right? There's a difference in kind of the gut reaction there. So we're encouraging you to move from the head to the heart and really think about your own story. Right? So I think oftentimes too, we can be tempted to minimize our experience and ourselves, but it's important to remember that the city council and decision makers ultimately work for you and are representing you. And so they need to hear from you, and your story is important to that piece. And again, can resonate deeply with them as they're making these decisions. So we don't want to throw all of our facts out the window, right? You just got some good talking points. And my recommendation is that you think about wrapping a story around one fact. So going back, sitting with those talking points later when you have your toolkit and saying, which of these really jumps off the page to me and connects with a piece of who I am, and roll with that one. So you know, facts are good. We want to use good science and grounded information. What I'm saying is you don't want to just throw number after number after number, if that makes sense. Okay, and the last point I wanted to make before we dive in is a point that our real villain here is the fossil fuel industry. Right? So decision makers are making the decisions, right? But they're being poked at from all sides, and especially by industry powers that be. So as we're crafting our story, kind of keeping in mind of who the villain is in the tale that we will be telling, and not villainizing, the council, you know, although we can hold them accountable. So there's a line there. Okay, I also wanted to just throw out a list of what do I mean when I say values. So the second half of this slide is just kind of a brainstorm that I came up with of different values that may resonate with you. So going through them, there's things like justice for all, equity, integrity, especially keeping our treaty promises, as we heard from Victoria, this is the land of the Puyallup tribe since time immemorial. Values like collaboration, accountability, safety over profit, clean air and water, responsibility, treating all with respect, right? So there's a whole spectrum of values out there that you can work with. This is just a list to start getting your creative mind going, but really naming why it is that you are in this fight, what the heart of your involvement is, and what your gut really tells you is right. Okay, let's go to our next slide, please. Okay, so when we're crafting our stories, I've broken it down into 3 different sections. So the first is, who are you? And there's 2 pieces to this. So thinking through who you are as an individual, and then also what communities you're connected to. And your individual identity is broad. We have a lot of different hats that we wear at various points in our days and weeks and years and lives. So when you're thinking about that, you don't want to say all of who you are, but think about the part of you that really resonates with this topic. So it could be that you're a grandparent or a student or a nurse. Think about the part of you that connects to the topic that you're speaking on. And then when you think about your community identity, that's important because it shows that you're connected to a broader network of people that generally will have the same values as you. So I often share what church I'm a member of, or I'll share that I'm a member of Earth Ministry. You can say what district you're in or what neighborhood you're in. If there's any community organizations, like many of the nonprofits co-hosting today that you are a part of, that shows our collective power. Number 2 is then, what do you value? So that's going back to that list and really naming what it is that your gut tells you is right. And that you can't help but at the end of the day say, you know what, this is really the path forward, is to act with responsibility, integrity, and enact justice for all. So thinking through what that is for you, each of us will have our own variation of our values. And then also thinking about what part of your story reflects those values. So we'll see a couple of examples shortly, and I'll explain kind of what I mean by what part of your experience reflects those when we get to that. The final piece, number 3, is to share what you want. So we want to get specific here. What we want as a coalition is to renew and strengthen the interim regulations. Strengthen them to include expansions of existing facilities, like we talked about before. So that's the specific ask of what the council will be voting on and how we would like them to vote. But there's also a larger vision of what you want. So thinking through, what is the vision for Tacoma, for your neighborhood, for the future that you really believe to be right? And generally, we're wanting a healthy and sustainable future for all. So you can share what that vision looks like for each of you. Okay, before we go to the next slide, I'm just going to give a quick scroll through the chat to see if there's any questions about. Okay, so it looks like more kind of back and forths. Okay, so let's go into a couple sample testimonies then. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so this is Pastor Nancy, and she I get the gift of working with her through Earth Ministry, and so she recorded a sample testimony for us, and hopefully our audio will work. I'm going to mute myself while we play to try that.
Good afternoon. My name is Reverend Nancy Ferree-Clark. I'm a recently retired United Methodist pastor, a proud resident of Tacoma, and a member of Earth Ministry. You may know that we recently celebrated the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. Marking that important date brought back memories for me of the first Earth Day during my junior year in high school, when I and my classmates were dismayed to learn that our planet was in serious trouble due to human intervention. We vowed that we could do better. I grew up on a dairy farm, so I have always loved nature, but I have also learned from my faith that environmental stewardship is not optional. God calls us to tend the magnificent creation which God has given us in order to preserve and protect it for the good of all people. This belief has been central to my life and ministry for many years. 50 years ago, I was hopeful about resolving the environmental crisis, but in many ways it has only worsened. Now we understand the devastating impact of greenhouse gas emissions, yet we continue to rely on dirty fuels, even as time is running out for saving our planet. The current COVID-19 crisis is showing us the inextricable connection of human health, the environment, and the economy. Fossil fuels clearly contribute to an increase in pollution and related health issues. Yet, to have a strong economy, we need healthy people. We must stop sacrificing the health of many for the wealth of a few. I believe we have a moral obligation to cut emissions now in order to create a just economy and a healthier world. Recalling my vow to do better many years ago, I am still hopeful that we can work together to resolve the climate crisis. As I look out on the beauty of Commencement Bay from my living room each day, I am grateful for the gift of this special place and the commitment many have made to protect it. I thank the City Council specifically for not allowing new fossil fuels in Tacoma while the Tideflats sub-area plan is being developed. But we need stronger protections. I urge you to do better by strengthening the interim regulations to include a ban on expansion of the existing facilities. Your leadership can help save our planet and heal our community. Please do what is right to help provide a healthy and sustainable future for us and generations still to come. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. And thanks again to Pastor Nancy. I believe she is on the call, so we're very grateful to have you here with us tonight. Okay, so let's kind of dig in and break down the different pieces of her testimony and see where we see those three different questions of who are you, what do you value, and what do you want. So at the beginning, Nancy identifies herself as a pastor and also a resident of Tacoma and a member of Earth Ministry. So you'll notice later on, she talks about how she grew up on a dairy farm, right? She could have pulled that piece of her identity out and led with that and really crafted her story around it. Instead, what she chose is to take a faith-based framework and have that approach in her testimony. And part of that too is thinking about what is unique, what really is a voice that I can bring forward that others can't, right? So if you're not a pastor, you're not going to speak as a pastor, and that's a special moral voice that she can bring to the coalition effort. She talks about her values, right? So she talks about her call to care for creation as part of her faith. She talks about the value of safety over profit and looking at how polluting industries and economic growth have been prioritized over public health and well-being for far too long. And she talks about a value of adaptation. So thinking about how we can change and grow and be innovative and not keep doing the same thing that we've been doing just because we've been doing it. So with that, she gets to what she wants. And in hers, the ask is at the end. We'll see another example where the ask is at the beginning. So you can think about where you want to put that within your testimony. But she gets really clear at the end and starts speaking more directly to council, shifting from her story into here's what I really want from you to be a good leader. And she asks specifically for the interim regulations to be renewed and strengthened to include expansions. And then she also paints a picture of this better world for future generations. And that's kind of her closing line and what she really ultimately is asking for and hoping their leadership will help accomplish. So that is a breakdown of that. We're going to look at one more testimony, and this is from Maya, who is a nurse and a member of Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility, as well as the Vashon Climate Action Group. So shout out to Sarah, who's an organizer on the call, who worked with Maya on this testimony.
Hello, my name is Maya Cyphers, and I work as a nurse practitioner in hospital palliative care in Pierce County, including in the city of Tacoma. I want to urge the City Council to extend the interim regulations prohibiting new fossil fuel projects. I have been seeing firsthand how pulmonary comorbidities greatly increase patients' morbidity and mortality in general, and also specifically in terms of surviving a COVID-19 infection. The fossil fuel industries are creating the climate and air pollution that multiple studies have revealed to be a driver for those pulmonary illnesses, such as asthma and COPD. Fossil fuel-driven climate disruption also increases the risk for novel zoonotic viruses to emerge by disrupting natural ecosystems and weather patterns. Please continue the moratorium on fossil fuel development, both future development and current projects. We do not need fossil fuel projects. We need continued development of sustainable renewables. And all studies also indicate that the development of green technology will be economically more robust in the future as we hopefully move ahead toward a better world. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to the next slide where we'll look at those three areas. Okay, so with Maya, her identity that she's sharing is that she is a nurse practitioner. And she really shares some of her expertise in that field in how she names the very real implications of air pollution on the patients that she treats every day. There's some jargon in there. Generally, we want to try to have as little jargon as possible, but also a lot of what she's saying is like pulmonary issues, morbidity, mortality, right? So things that we can kind of understand that are heavy hitting. In terms of her values, I pulled out 3 that I heard in there. So she clearly values health and well-being and has committed herself to a profession that really lives that out actively. And part of what contributes to health and well-being is clean air. And so she really connects those two clearly and says, I value this, therefore I value clean air. And another value I heard in her testimony is accountability. So she does call out the fossil fuel industry as the villain and says, this is the source of these pollutants and we should not allow it to continue. She then, for her, she does her ask at the beginning of very clearly saying, what she wants in terms of the specifics of renewing the interim regulations. And she also comes back to that at the end. So she has a bit more of a sandwich approach. And at the end, I liked how she names that she visions a future of renewable energy instead of fossil fuels. So that's a different overall vision. It includes a healthy and safe, sustainable future, but it's a different way to paint that picture, which is really good to have a variety of different angles that we're coming in at that. So let me think if there's anything else that I would like to touch on. We really appreciate both of these examples and for sharing your testimonies with us and with a broader group here. Marquise talked a little bit about the format. It's looking like it's going to be a phone. So that's a little easier. For a while, we thought it might have been a video, so you could have talked. And when you're there in person, you want to do the best that you can to make eye contact and really be personable. When you're on the phone, you have the benefit of being able to read your testimony, and so I encourage you to write it out and practice it a couple times, and you can really pay attention to your inflection and what points you want to emphasize as you read it out on the phone. Okay, I think we might have a question. Is that right, Tony?
That's correct. So you can put your questions in the Q&A section if that's easier for people, and then we can get to the questions. I don't think we have any specifically on this though.
Okay, we've got how many folks that I think we got all of our questions answered right now. So if more arise, feel free to drop those in the Q&A. We're going to talk a little bit more with some wrap-up technicalities, and I'm also happy to be a resource. So feel free to contact me at jessica@earthministry.org, and I'm always happy to take a look at testimony and provide feedback and encouragement. And the one thing too, I think before I close, I just really want to encourage you to go for it, right? So I called Pastor Nancy and we went back and forth kind of talking through her testimony and really she was able to find her voice, and I just love to see that process grow. And that can happen in each of you. And I invite you to just remember that beginning point, which is that your story really matters and they work for you and need to hear from you. And so if you're an old timer and you've been testifying with us every 6 months, thank you for your persistence and keep telling your story. And part of your story can be that you're tired of showing up every 6 months. That's fine to tell. And if you're new, I encourage you to dive in because we need as many voices as possible to help show the diversity of our coalition. All right, so I think with that, I will turn it back over to Marquise.
Awesome, thank you. So I just want to say thank you everyone for bearing with us in our technical difficulties. I'm not as quite familiar with webinars as I am with just general Zoom meetings, and obviously I'm an in-person kind of guy. I think we saw a comment in there about where to email city council, or how to email in a testimonial. So you can email the city clerk, and that'll be in our toolkit as well with the actual email in there. But yeah, so let's keep it going. So here is the renewal process timeline. Full disclosure, things are changing so much that if anybody has information that we don't have, feel free to drop it in the comments. If you, I don't think there's been any update to this timeline, but if you somehow know that and you feel confident about that, doesn't hurt to let other folks know, or communicate where you got the information if it's possible. So there has been a couple timelines for interims renewal. So it's been moved twice now, and we have a planning staff that's been working really hard to make sure that, or the city of Tacoma, sorry, has a planning staff that's been working to make sure these are actualized, but obviously because of COVID-19 and the governor's orders and things are changing, it's kind of hard for them to really, I think, lock down some of this stuff. And obviously the city is worrying about a lot of things right now. So there's a lot on their plate, so we want to give them some grace, but this is the information that we have, is that there's a public hearing May 5th, and so folks should get their comments in before that public hearing, just to be safe. There will be a study session, possibly, which is where members of city council are informed on some new information, or how hearings went, etc. We haven't heard when that will be, but that could be on the docket. There will also be a first reading of the ordinance, and then a final reading where there's usually a vote. So that's the current timeline that we have right now. And then toolkit. So we're going to jump into Q&A after this. So folks have questions. Tony and some of the other folks who are kind of keeping an eye on the chat will jump back in and we'll help facilitate those questions. But just for a second, I want to show folks the toolkit. So we have a little toolkit ready for you. So bear with me as I jump out of screen share. I'm actually just going to get it ready so this isn't so clunky. So give me 1 second. Should be back now. Boom, there we go. All righty. So we have a little toolkit for y'all that has some materials. So in it, the main 4 items we have are the introduction video that 350 Tacoma made last year. That's really excellent, as you already saw. You probably saw it 3 times now, but you only had the audio one of those times. So I highly recommend rewatching it to get your water wings on the interim regulations if you're not super used to this stuff. We also have a interim regulations in the Tacoma Tideflats Coalition 1-pager that just talks a little bit more about the regulations, and then the coalition that the facilitators and I are in, that organize around interim regulations, sub-area plan, and some other things. This 1-pager is specifically about interim regulations, though. There's a fossil fuel study that our policy and technical manager, Aaron, has been working on, that we have a 1-pager report in this toolkit, and I'll show you that in a second. I think Aaron might jump in to talk about that report. And then the final component of our toolkit that we made for y'all, Earth Ministry so graciously created a testimonial worksheet. And so it's kind of fun. When I was looking at it, I was like immediately taken back to like middle school, where you had to like actually fill out worksheets and stuff, because now we're in the digital era. So if folks want to print it off, that'd be really cute. But there is a worksheet that takes you through how to give testimonial and how to craft your story. So here's the video. As you can see, you'll have to click on it to go to YouTube to actually view it, because you can't look at videos in Google Docs. We have our 1-pager that's about the coalition and the regulations that folks should feel free to read through. It's about a 3-minute read. There's our 1-pager for our fossil fuel study that CHB is just getting out, so folks can take a peek at that and see the expansions of some of the capacity of our current polluting industries in the port. And then the Share Your Story worksheet that folks should feel free to print out and go through. But if you don't want to print it out, there's still just a lot of good information in here. And Aaron, did you want to jump in real quick?
Yeah. Hi,
there we
everybody.
Go. Hey, Aaron.
So this hopefully will answer maybe a couple of the questions I've seen in the chat about the fossil fuel study that the city of decided that they would do at the end of last year as part of the climate emergency resolution. I at CHB started doing some of that research before that resolution, and it's finally ready. So I made a 1-pager, and I also put the post with all of the detailed information is also up on our website, and I can put the link to that in the chat. It's also, we just posted about it on Twitter and Facebook, but basically what I found, and I chose to look at US Oil and Seaport Sound, which are the two biggest fossil fuel facilities in the Tideflats, and got some data, big data sets from Department of Ecology, and kind of made some comparisons with their permits that tell them basically what they're allowed to do. And it's become pretty clear that Tacoma is seeing more and more fossil fuels. So I started looking at the end of 2016 and went through the end of 2019. So like, for example, this first graph that you guys can see here shows the volume of crude oil that's been coming into Tacoma by rail. And so the blue line is the volume of, or the blue bars are the volume of crude oil coming in by rail. And then that orange line shows the percentage of that total volume that is actually like the nastiest, heaviest type of crude oil. So the data is broken up by the type of crude oil, and that orange line represents how much of it is the big, bad, heavy stuff that will sink in water if it is spilled. And then, and so we can take that information and we know like how many more rail cars that, can you go back up just a little bit, Marquise? You know, we know from the volume of oil, like that's how many rail cars are coming through, and each rail car brings with it a risk of derailment and catching on fire. And so we know like the rail traffic that is happening because of this volume of oil. We know the shipping traffic that is happening because of this volume of oil, which also has its own risks in terms of spills and noise disturbances to our orcas and salmon. And so, you know, I don't want to talk too much about this because I think we're probably getting ready to wrap up, but the one pager is here in the toolkit. And then I'm going to, and maybe Marquise could put the link to the post in the toolkit as well. And I'll also, or we'll like put it in the notes and we'll get it out to you guys so you can see the full report. And, you know, we talked a lot about, you know, speaking from the heart. And I think that's super important, obviously. And I think we also want to have the data to back up our concerns too. So that's what I'm hoping will go through with this information that we have brought about. So does that, okay, I don't think that there were, okay, the link. Kathy, I'm gonna put the link, I'm grabbing it right now, and I'm gonna put it in the chat. And then we're also gonna send it out to all of the webinar participants in notes. So I'm gonna get that here in just a second.
Alrighty, thank you so much, Erin. So
yeah.
We're gonna jump into trying to finish out the Q&A. I think we're gonna try to take questions and just have our various facilitators read them off and answer them instead of trying to like popcorn around to people and the participants, because as you can see, technology is not my strong suit, so I don't really want to screw things up. So if anyone who is ready with questions wants to jump in now, we can do that. Alrighty, I think we, oh, how do we, yeah, okay. So I see, how do we submit written comments? So let me actually go back to the toolkit and that'll be in there. But basically what you do is you will submit your written comments to, yeah, I'm still on screen share, cool. So you're gonna you will have to submit your comments to the city clerk's office via email. So that's just cityclerk@citytacoma.org. And so if you're going to be doing a video testimonial and you want to connect with us, you should feel free to email me. But if you want to do a written comment via email, obviously, you're going to submit your comment to cityclerk@cityoftacoma.org. Try to have it in before the hearing, so that way to make sure it gets entered. And yeah, let's go back to some of the questions.
I would love to address Moby's question in the chat. So Moby says that the examples we shared seem to be people who play a larger role in the community. What if you're just an average person? So I want to first say there's no such thing as just average. We're all people and our stories all matter. And I know you can say, okay, yeah, Jess, sure. But we all have our experiences that we can bring to the table here. And that can be in a community leadership role, and it can also be as a resident. It can be something like maybe you're a long time Tacoman and you remember the Asarco mess. Maybe you just want to talk about how you can smell the pollution, or if you spend time around the port, you get a headache, right? You can talk about your family, your loved ones, right? So I invite you to expand your thinking of yourself to really know that your experience matters and is representative of a lot of other people who would also think that they're just an average person as well. So they need to hear both from leaders and from all of us. And I see your comment. No, it's totally not rude at all. I think it's something I try to say at the beginning of my talk because I think it's human nature in us. So it's something to kind of actively have that dialogue with yourself about and push back on that natural inclination to minimize yourself and your story. Thanks.
Cool. Are folks wanting us to go back over? Oh, sorry, Aaron's here. Are folks feeling like they need us to go back over how to submit public comment, or are folks have enough information and can do it via the toolkit? So if anybody wants us to run back through, you can comment real quick. Otherwise, I think we'll jump on to the next question.
I think just real quick, there were a couple of questions about submitting comments. So if you are submitting written comment for this public hearing that is on Tuesday, you need to submit it to the city clerk's office by 4 p.m. on Tuesday, May 5th. And we are going to, in the toolkit, we'll make sure that the email address for the city clerk's office is on there, as well as a mailing address if you want to do snail mail. And then we are also trying to get a handle on how or if city council is going to accept comments virtually, like through a webinar like this. We think that they likely will, but we're not sure on the logistics yet. And as soon as we find all that stuff out, we are going to let everybody know. So yeah, comments, if you're writing them in, emailing them in, they need to be in by 4 p.m. this Tuesday, May 5th. And yeah, we're gonna put how to do all of that in the toolkit. And I wanna make sure that I didn't miss. Okay, and then there was another question about did Seaport Sound actually add new infrastructure to double their rail capacity? And the answer is yes. They submitted and were approved for a land use permit last year, and that doubled the number of crude oil rail offloading stations on their property. And if you go to the big report that I did, and I did put the link in the chat, that has references to that permit application and the analysis that was done to figure out, like, okay, that many rail cars offloading stations equals this much fossil fuels. So that did happen. And yeah, so I'll hand it back over to Marquise for wrapping up.
Cool. Thank you so much, Aaron. So yeah, that concludes our webinar. I think we're I think if we have any more questions, folks can feel free to email us. So how about we have, can the panelists go and drop their emails if they'd like to, or they should, just anyways. So I'm gonna drop mine real quick. If folks want to follow up with any of us. So here's mine. Thank you to everyone who spoke. Tony, are you jumping in real quick? Nope, cool. Okay, perfect. So thank you to everyone that spoke and everyone that tuned in. Thanks for sitting with us. We really appreciate it. We're obviously all in this fight together. So we'll be getting our toolkit out either later today or first thing in the morning, and we have everyone's emails. So that's where that'll go out. We're also going to share it with our social media, like our Facebook, our Instagram, our Twitter, and then we'll have our toolkit in the next arising issues that we send out, which is our mailing list. So if you'd like to get on that, email me if you're not already on it. So that'll be getting out. So folks will have that soon. And I think with all that, we're going to end this. So if folks want to give any of our speakers or anything that they heard a shout out in the chat, feel free to. Otherwise, we're going to call this good. So thanks for bearing with us. Have a great night. Make sure to stay safe. And we hope that you'll submit a written comment. And if you need any support on that, we're here for you. You can always give us a call or an email, any of the orgs, and we'll be there for you. Alrighty. Thank you, everyone. Take care and have a good night.